Hi you guys, I thought I would do something a little different this week for the logic class and speak to you a little bit more directly. So I'm going to go over some of the information you need to complete your assignments for this week in this video here. Okay. So first off, let's talk a little bit about review. Last week I had you read and learn about and then practice some exercises based on compound sentences and their corresponding functions. You went over the conjunction function, the disjunction function, the negation function, and the conditional function, okay? We're gonna hold off on using functions this week, but they're gonna come back into play during week 12. This week we're gonna focus more on the sentences, the content of those sentences, and how to translate them from English into a technical language that'll help us evaluate with more clarity in formal logic. So really quick, just for the sake of some review, let's talk about those compound sentences for just a minute. So I think it might be just a good idea to bring up some examples of the various compound sentences we went over, and I'm going to use examples directly from your text. So they're going to include those really fun Greek names that aren't so commonplace anymore, but definitely fun to use. The sentence, Aristo is coming home and Stilpo is coming home. Just to review, that's an example of a conjunction. It's a compound sentence that is a conjunction, okay? It's a conjunction because the two embedded statements are joined together by the operator and. So any sentence where you have two embedded sentences joined together by the operator and, you have a conjunction sentence. All right. Another one. Aristo is coming home or Stilpo is coming home. This is a disjunction because those two embedded sentences are joined by the operator or. And just to be clear, the first embedded sentence is Aristo is coming home. The second embedded sentence is Stilpo is coming home. These are simple sentences by themselves, but when they're joined together by a sentence operator, they make a compound sentence. So, the disjunction, one more time. Aristo is coming home or Stilpo is coming home. All right, we'll talk about a negation really quick. How about this example? It's not the case that Aristo is coming home, period. Now, the operator is not, and it presents itself before the single embedded sentence, because in a negations compound, you only need one embedded sentence. It doesn't require more embedded sentences, okay? So it is not the case that Aristo is coming home. In fact, anytime you have a negation, what is being negated is one embedded sentence, okay? All right, and finally we went over the conditional. If Aristo comes home, then Stilpo will come home. The operator is if. It's placed in an English sentence at the very beginning of the overall statement. The first embedded sentence, Aristo comes home, is the antecedent. You see maybe a comma or a then, and you're given the second embedded sentence, or what we call the consequent. If Aristo comes home, then Stilpo comes home. So the negation is the only compound sentence we went over that functions according to one embedded sentence. The other compound sentences require at least two embedded sentences, okay? They're joining together two ideas. All right. So, like I said, this week we're going to work on learning how to translate these compound sentences into a formal language. And just to give you a little definition, on page 250, formal language is defined for you by your author. The quote is, it's a language created by a group of people to communicate a specialized and restricted body of ideas. So symbolic languages help us remove vagueness and ambiguity from the meaning of sentences, and that's what's going to help us evaluate these sentences according to the principles of truth functional logic with a lot more clarity. So let's start talking about the formal language and how it's going to present itself. You are going to have to learn a new language and new rules of grammar, but luckily it's very small. It's extremely limited. It's not too much to learn, but it's going to take a little bit of practice, which is why this entire week will be devoted to the formal language. All right. So first, let's talk about the sentence operators in our truth functional compounds that we're dealing with. Now we're talking about and, or, not, if. We're also going to add another one, if and only if. That's the biconditional sentence operator. It is associated with a biconditional truth function, but we won't address that until week 12. Right now, I just want you to learn about the biconditional sentence operator, or if and only if, within the confines of the formal language, okay? Now, the operator and will be represented by the ampersand, or the and symbol, okay? So anytime you're translating a conjunction compound and you need to translate the and from English into the technical language, you're going to exchange the and with an ampersand. Similarly with the rest of the symbols I'm going to go over today. Okay. The or the disjunction operator, will be represented by the wedge. The not will be represented by a tilde. And the conditional will be represented by a horseshoe. The biconditional, the if and only if, that will be represented by the triple bar. Now, if you by any chance do any outside research or Googling or look up anything about truth functional logic, you might see other symbols representing the conditional and the biconditional operators. You might see, for example, an arrow to represent the conditional operator, going from the antecedent to the consequent. Or for the biconditional operator, you might see a double-sided arrow. Okay, I'm fine with you using the arrow, double-sided arrow, or the horseshoe and the triple bar. Whatever you feel most comfortable with according to your research and how you're doing the assignments. The text that we rely on, Herrick's text, uses the horseshoe and the triple bar. So that's what I'm going to just assume that you'll use, and that'll be the example operator symbol I provide in this week's content folder for you. All right. Let's also talk a little bit about sentence constants. Now, the constants in the technical language that we'll be using for truth functional logic, they're simply represented by capitalized A, B, C, D, any letter in the alphabet, okay? What they're representing are embedded statements in compound statements. Now, we'll get back to that. Let's consider first the 3 rules of grammar. These are presented to you on page 251. I'll go over all 3 of them. Number 1, any sentence constant that stands alone is a sentence in TL, okay? So the example is P. Now, all the examples for the rules of grammar on this page use the letters P and Q. P and Q are variables, and they aren't representing anything other than the rule in this instance, okay? So imagine P being a simple sentence like, Phil lives in New York, who's my brother, who I've talked about, and it happens to be a true statement. Phil lives in New York. That's a simple statement that I can pretty reasonably represent with P. Okay, so you go ahead and you can use examples if you want, but also know that P and Q, they function primarily as variables in most logic text. All right, the second rule. If P is a sentence of TL, or the technical language, then tilde P is a sentence of TL. Also tilde Q, or tilde A, right? This would be a negation statement. So for example, it's not the case that Phil lives in New York. That would be represented by not P. It's a sentence in English, and it also functions grammatically as a sentence in the technical language. And number 3, if P and Q are sentences of TL, then we can write them in TL. P ampersand Q. For example, Phil lives in New York and Quincy lives in New York. Okay? You have 2 embedded sentences that are represented by the constants P and Q, and then you also have the and, the sentence operator of the conjunction compound, represented by the ampersand. There's also examples provided to you in your text that show the other compound sentences translated correctly into their compounds in English, right? So you have P ampersand Q, P wedge Q, which is a disjunction, tilde P, which is a negation, we already went over that one, excuse me, P horseshoe Q, a conditional, and P triple bar Q, which is a biconditional. All right. So again, the sentence constants in TL represent the embedded sentences or the component statements of any compound sentence. P and Q are common variables, and the sentence operators are translated into their corresponding symbols, which is on page 250 if you need to go and review that throughout the week. All right, so we can go back to those 4 sentences we used as examples in the beginning of the video when we were reviewing, and we can translate those 4 sentences into the technical language. So if I were to say, Aristo is coming home and Stilpo is coming home, that would be translated into A ampersand S. Now, I chose A and S. Why did I choose A and S as the sentence constants? Because it's pretty obvious. It's like a rational choice, right? A is the first letter of the subject of the component statement, the first component statement, Aristo. S is the first letter of the second component statement, Stilpo. It's a common way to assign sentence constants to compound sentences in English when you're translating them into TL, and I would absolutely encourage you practice that. And over the course of the week, you will be practicing that. So that would be translated into A and S. If we translated the disjunction sentence into the technical language, into TL, it would be A wedge S. If we translated the negation sentence, which was it's not the case that Aristo is coming home, it would be tilde A, just a singular constant there, and the tilde in front. Okay, and if we translated the conditional statement, if Aristo comes home, then Stilpo comes home, it would be A horseshoe S. And let's do a biconditional just for fun here. Let's say I said, if and only if Aristo comes home, then Stilpo comes home. That's a biconditional compound sentence, and I would translate it as follows. A triple bar S. All right. Let's see here. Now, another thing I want you guys to read over in great detail after this video is, and for the sake of your assignments, is on the rules of grammar and what's called well-formed formulas, or how to correctly construct these sentences with parentheses, brackets, and braces. You'll get through all of that information throughout the week, and of course if you have any questions on that or you want me to review your work, I can do that throughout the week as well. You'll notice one thing, I believe it's page 254, I think, and that is the difference between operators that require only one embedded sentence and operators that require at least 2 embedded sentences. The only operator we deal with that requires 1 embedded sentence, that does not function with 2, or doesn't require joining 2 to be a functional operator, is the tilde. The conjunction, the disjunction, and the conditional and the biconditional, they're all joining statements together, okay? So they are what we call dyadic, and they require 2 individual components, okay? All right. Now on page 258, you have a very good exercise. They aren't listed as exercises, but you guys can go over them. It's just titled sentences, and it's under the larger title, How to Use TL Operators. And it lists a handful of sentences for you, and then it translates them right next to them. It translates those sentences for you, okay? So I actually don't have the sentences right in front of me, but I know the translations are, you have a simple translation, or how we would translate a simple sentence into TL, conjunction, conditional, disjunction, and negation. Let's say I was to combine some of those example sentences and create larger compound sentences with more than one operator. How would I translate that into TL? That's immediately addressed in the following pages, right? The pages following 258, all right? So let me give you an example of one that I'm just making up, and I'll show you how it would look when it's translated into the technical language. So let's say I said, and I'm just combining those sentences from page 258, so they might not make a lot of sense, but that's okay because we're worried more about the translation than anything else. If Alice is a mile high, then it is not the case that the Hatter's hat is his own. Okay, so what you have here is you have two sentence operators. You have an if and you have a not, right? You have three component sentences. Or no, I'm sorry, you have two component sentences and two operators, right? Now, because you have an if at the very beginning of the sentence, you know you can go ahead and write a horseshoe down, all right? And because you have a not, you know you can go ahead and write a tilde down. And if you read the sentence correctly, you'll see that the not is in the consequent, or the second half of the conditional statement. So I would write it behind the horseshoe, not in front of the horseshoe, okay? If we read the sentence, if Alice is a mile high, then it is not the case that the Hatter's hat is his own. Then we can consider what the antecedent is. If Alice is a mile high, how did we translate how did we translate Alice is a mile high? We translated it with an A, okay? So you have A, horseshoe, and now tilde, and then it is not the case that the Hatter's hat is his own. A sentence you had already looked at that translation, that would be tilde H. So you have A, horseshoe, tilde H, okay? We can do another example like this. Alice is a mile high, and if everyone minded their own business, the world would go much faster than it does. All right, so now you have two sentence operators, okay? You have an and, you also have an if, so you know you're dealing with a conjunction, and you know you're dealing with a conditional statement as well. Now, if you look at go ahead and write that ampersand down, okay, so we can address Alice is a mile high, because we know it's going to be a ampersand and then a conditional after that, okay? Now, if you look back to well-formed formulas and how these sentences are correctly translated, you know that the symbol of the operator stands in between two other sentences, and how they are correctly translated in TL depends on what kind of sentence it is. So you have the ampersand, and in front of the ampersand you have just an A, because in the English sentence you had a simple sentence in front of the and, okay? Now, behind the and, or on the other side of the and, you have a compound sentence, and it's a conditional sentence. Think back to how you correctly translate a conditional sentence. You put a horseshoe in between the antecedent and the consequent, okay? So here what you have is and, ampersand, conditional sentence, all right? So what you want to do is you want to correctly translate a conditional sentence and put that on the other side of the ampersand and put it in parentheses, all right? There is a section in the text that says how to use parentheses, and that will include, of course, a description of how to use brackets and braces, and again, I encourage you to check that out. But just really quick, to get back to this sentence, it would be and, ampersand, parentheses, E, horseshoe, W. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So I did also just want to take a look at the exercises you guys are going to be doing for the week, and just go through an example of each of a problem from all the exercises with you, okay? So 12.3 and 12.4, all you're being asked to do is translate English sentences into TL. So that is all you'll be practicing this week. If we look at 12.3, we can go ahead and give this one a look right now. The English sentence says this: if it is not the case that all Victorian-era logicians are philosophers, then it is not the case that some Victorian-era logicians are philosophers. Now, first things first, don't be thrown off by the fact that this compound sentence uses categorical sentences, because we're not in categorical logic anymore, we're in truth functional logic. So focus on the operators, focus on the component statements or the embedded sentence, and definitely in this exercise, focus on translating, right? You have three operators. You have three operators in this sentence. You have an if, you have a not in the antecedent, and you have a not in the consequent, okay? Now, you use the horseshoe to represent the if when you translate an English sentence into TL. So go ahead and write a horseshoe down, and in the place of the antecedent, or the the statement that you put before the horseshoe, all right, you're going to have a negation. Okay, it says, it is not the case that all Victorian era logicians are philosophers, right? Now, I would put in this one tilde A. That's what I would use. But you can use whatever you want to use as long as it's different from the other embedded sentence that is different in English, okay? You don't want to use the same letter to represent many different English sentences. That would not be correct, okay? So I would go tilde A, horseshoe. Now, the consequent in English says this: then it is not the case that some Victorian era logicians are philosophers. So there, what I would put is tilde S. All right? So now what you have is you have tilde A representing the statement that it's not the case that all Victorian era logicians are philosophers. Horseshoe, tilde S representing the statement that it's not the case that some Victorian era logicians are philosophers. And that horseshoe is what makes the entire sentence a conditional, right? If it is not the case that all Victorian era logicians are philosophers, then it is not the case that some Victorian era logicians are philosophers. Tilde A, horseshoe, tilde S. Okay? All right, exercise 12.4. I also wanted to do the first example with you there. Number 1, if the white rabbit is not home, then Alice will not have lunch today. Okay? I'm sorry, if the white rabbit is not home, then Alice will not have lunch today. Yes, that's correct. I'm just reading it off these notes. Very similar. In fact, it's the exact same kind of sentence, all right? You have a conditional statement with a negation as the antecedent and a negation as the consequent. So using the exact same formula we used for the last example, you would translate this into tilde W, horseshoe, tilde A. Okay? All right. The very last set of exercises is 12.5, and in this set of exercises, you're given a number of technical language formulas, okay? So you're given compound sentences that have already been translated into the technical language, so they're symbolized, and you're being asked to pick out the main operator. So the main operator, that's a concept that I'm going to have you write about, and it is definitely a concept that you're going to need to read about towards the end of this chapter. When you're dealing with truth functional sentences, compound sentences that have many operators, like the last two we dealt with, they do not all share in range, okay? You think about the last example we dealt with, right? If the white rabbit is not home, then Alice will not have lunch today. You think about that. The very first not only refers to the statement, the white rabbit is home. It only refers to that statement. The second not only refers to the statement, Alice will have lunch, right? That is the scope. That's what we call the scope of those nots, okay? So they are negation operators, and they only refer to the statement they're negating, all right? Now, this sentence, that example, happens to be two negations joined together. And what are they joined together by? They're joined together by the horseshoe, by the if, okay? In this sentence, the if is the main operator because it has the largest scope. It has the farthest reach, okay? The if operator refers to the negation of the antecedent and the negation of the consequent. It touches every aspect of the sentence, okay? So in the final set of exercises, you're being asked to define which operator is the main operator simply by viewing symbolized compound sentences, all right? If we take a look at the first example, it's a large compound sentence, and I'll read it out. Tilde, parentheses, A and S, in parentheses, ampersand, tilde, parentheses, G or B, in parentheses, okay? what you need to do is you need to figure out exactly which operator has the largest scope, or which operator affects the most or has the final say. And what do I mean by final say? I mean, what kind of sentence is this? Is it a conditional? Is it a conjunction? Is it a negation? Okay? I would say for this one, it's a conjunction, all right? The tildes have reached to the parentheses, okay, to each conjunct, right? The first tilde extends through the first conjunct and ends. The second tilde extends through the second conjunct and ends, okay? The two ampersands inside the parentheses, they clearly have a limited reach because they're bracketed in, right? But those tildes are a little questionable. The ampersand, however, joins together two negated parenthetical conjunctions, okay? Two negated conjunctions, brings them together. And ultimately, this sentence is a conjunction. It functions most fundamentally according to the operator and, all right? So there's not too many of those exercises you need to do, but they're very important. They will be extremely important for week 12. And, you know, if you have any questions regarding any of this material, please feel free to email me, and we can always schedule a phone conversation as well to talk over questions you have. All right, that's it, guys. I hope you have a really great week.